What have I just done?
There are two people that you don't want to hear say, oops, what have I done? Your airplane pilot and your podcast host.
Yes, quite.
I think one more than the other, honestly.
Episode 98, Armageddon with Bart Ehrman. This is Matthew, and in this episode of Still Unbelievable, Andrew and I welcome Bart Ehrman to discuss his latest book, Armageddon, what the Bible really says about the end. I enjoyed reading this book, I learned a few things, and I appreciated Bart's writing style. So if this is a topic that interests you, then this is a book that's worth reading. During this discussion, we are also joined by David from Skeptics and Seekers, because we didn't know if Andrew would be available for the whole recording. So David sat in as a backstop in case Andrew had to drop out. I also want to recommend two other podcasts that Bart has been on to discuss this book. They are The Graceful Atheist and I Was a Teenage Fundamentalist. Both of these interviews cover things that we don't address in this discussion. I was at an advantage in that I had listened to both of those interviews before hosting Bart here, and so I intentionally avoided some topics that are covered by them. So please, go and listen to those two episodes as well. Links are in the show notes. Hello everybody, and welcome to another episode of Still Unbelievable. Your regular hosts, Matthew and Andrew, are here on the mic. How are you, Andrew? Good day to you, sir.
Oh, good day to you as well. And I am excited to be here. I expect that this will not only be the best Still Unbelievable yet, but it may well be the best one we can ever do. I'm excited about our guest, so I'll leave it with you.
And for the benefit of the listeners listening to this a couple of weeks after I've edited it, you're excited today because Tucker Carlson has left Fox News. Is that why you're excited today?
Oh, and they didn't even let him sign off. It was the best piece of news in the United States. Fantastic.
All right then. Okay. All right then. And listeners, in case you didn't recognize that laugh, welcome to our guest today, Professor Bart Ehrman. Thank you so much for taking time to join us.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Everybody probably knows who you are, but just in case for the one listener we've got who doesn't know you, you're the author of 30 or more books plus various articles and reviews in the arena of biblical scholarship. You're often quoted by Christians as well as atheists, and you started your teaching career at Rutgers University and you joined the faculty of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 1988, where you are the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor, and you've served as both the Director of Graduate Studies and the Chair of the department. How has that been working in teaching that kind of subject as somebody who no longer believes in the literacy of much of that text?
Oh, well, that's great. I mean, when I first started teaching at Chapel Hill in 1988, I was still a Christian believer, but I wasn't an evangelical, and I didn't believe in the literal understanding of the Bible, or that it was, without any errors at all. The thing is that one of the purposes of a university education is to get students to learn how to think. And religious studies, especially biblical studies in the American South, is a perfect, it's the perfect storm, because students come to class, they tend to have conservative backgrounds, they tend to have conservative religious backgrounds, and they're introduced to all sorts of material they've never heard before, they had no idea, and it makes them think. So quite apart from whatever else they get out of the class, they're just more or less forced to try and reconcile what they've thought with what they're now hearing. And so it's not like teaching a class on Chaucer or something where students don't have a vested idea about, the whatever, one of the stories in Chaucer. And so whereas you study the Gospel of John, it's like, oh my God, you mean that's not historically accurate? And so it forces them to think. So I think it's a very good thing for a university to have.
I imagine it is. And because Andrew and I are also former fundamentalists and we've had our own deconstruction journeys, and I still spend a lot of time in deconstruction groups because there's quite a few of them on Facebook. And the theme of university education comes up an awful lot, and people go, and some people's parents refuse to send them to certain universities because they're too liberal. There's too much of a danger of their Christianity being watered down. So I imagine that you probably are in a unique position to see a lot of students go through this conflict from their fundamental Christianity that have been indoctrinated into through what the effect an education has on that. So you're probably in a unique position to help them through what's going on there.
I don't get too many deconversions actually during my classes,
Right.
and which is good, because I don't think somebody who's believed something for 19 years after listening to somebody for 2 months should give it all up. I mean, it seems like you need to think about it.
No.
And so I certainly don't encourage anybody to deconvert. I don't try to convert anybody or deconvert anybody. I'm teaching the New Testament from a historical perspective, and it's a perspective they've never heard before or heard of before, and they realize often they realize that it causes difficulties for what they've already believed. It doesn't mean they have to stop believing what they believe,
No.
but it does mean that they need to think about it and figure it out, because the history is not going away. And they, and some students I think probably eventually do leave the faith, but I have other students who write me and tell me that my class has strengthened their faith because it's made them try and figure out intellectually how to deal with it.
It's interesting you say that, because I know this. We will get onto your book, I do promise. But I thought this would be a fascinating opportunity to talk about that kind of dynamic. But interesting what you've just said, because when I was first struggling with my faith and I realised that my fundamentalist faith was changing, I spent a lot of time consuming Christian podcasts, because podcasts had just exploded, and I found that listening to Christian podcasts helped me to question it and helped me out. they didn't do what I wanted. They didn't do to me what I really wanted them to do to me, which was to make it stronger.
Well, the thing is, if you see, if you get convinced that evidence really matters, and then you see the evidence for one view, and then you hear somebody defending the other view, if you've got an open mind, a lot of times you're going to think, oh man, that's not convincing. I mean, I remember when I was in graduate school, we had to read, books that at the time I was an evangelical, I didn't agree with, but then I'd read the refutation of it and I say, oh my God, that's worse than the book I just read. In fact, I think this guy has something going for him.
I am pretty sure that you are the demonstration that fundamental evangelicalism is false. You have written so many books debunking Christian fundamentalism that if they were right, you should at least get an honorable mention in the book of Revelation, or maybe a dishonorable mention.
Well, so some people think I have been mentioned in the book Revelation and worked out that I'm 666.
Oh, awesome. I'd like to see the math behind that.
So I was just kidding, but are you serious? Is that actually true? Because I was just...
No, it's not true. But it is true that my students do point out that the phone number of the Department of Religious Studies, my department at UNC Chapel Hill, is 919-962-5666.
Awesome.
Because of course it is.
You don't think that's an accident?
Do you want us to cut that number out? Because we can if you do.
No, they can call all they want. It's not my phone number. It's the department phone number.
That's brilliant. So moving rapidly on then, you're here because you've written another book. And I've got a really humble confession to make. I don't think Andrew heard me mention this earlier, but this is the first book of yours I've managed to read. For some reason, despite you being mentioned to me multiple times through the last 20 years, this is the first time I've actually sat down and read one of your books, which is a terrible, terrible admission. But I genuinely loved it. I genuinely enjoyed it. I found it really easy. Because of your reputation, I expected something that was going to be more cerebral. So, something that required a stronger education to read through. But I found it was very readable and very accessible in the language. So thank you for that. And I'm definitely going to find more of your books and read them, because I enjoyed it far more than I thought I would. So thank you for writing it.
Well, you're welcome. I mean, the thing is that, I write different kinds of books, and so some of my books really are for scholars, and they're hard hitting, they're cerebral, and without a graduate education in the field, some of them would be hard to understand. But when I'm writing a book for a general audience, my idea is to communicate what is sometimes complicated scholarly understandings of things at a popular level, at a level that people can understand. And it's tricky because you don't want to dumb things down. That's patronizing. I don't like doing that. But you do need to explain things in very simple terms for an educated audience, and it's a fine line. And so I try to keep with my books for general audiences, I try to keep things interesting. And that's really, I think, the key is to figure out what about this is interesting. And boy, there's a lot of things that are interesting about the book of Revelation.
Boy, there are.
It's probably the least read and least understood by Christians of the books in the Bible.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. And it's because when the people start reading it, they're either reading it as a fundamentalist, where they're looking for a word or a verse here or there that will contribute to their views, but they don't read it like from beginning to end to try and understand it as a book. And most other people who read it just find it too weird and bizarre to finish it because and so part of my book is trying to explain that there's nothing to be afraid of in the book of Revelation. If you have it explained to you what's actually going on here, it's not that complicated a plot. And once you start figuring out the symbolism, as the author hints, the author gives you hints about what the symbolism is all about. Once you see how these hints work, then it's not that difficult. But for the first time through, man, it drives almost everybody crazy.
So if we can stick on that point for a moment, if you're approaching a serious study of the book of Revelation, or even a semi-serious study, how do you do that with confidence that you're getting the right answer? As for instance, obviously, you're not a great study here because you've got such a deep background that you've got a serious advantage over the vast majority of people that will ever read the book of Revelation, right? You come to it as a scholar, and most people just can't get there. So how do you advise people to come to the book of Revelation and have confidence in the conclusions they draw if you have a recipe for getting that done?
Well, I think it's true for all of the Bible, actually, not just Revelation. It'd be true of the Gospels, for example, or the writings of Paul, or the Hebrew prophets, and it's true for most ancient literature generally, that you need some guidance. I've spent the last 50 years intensely studying the Bible. And so I do have the leg up 50 years. And so scholars, that's what scholars do. But I think you have to decide whom you're going to trust to begin with. Are you going to trust someone like Hal Lindsey, who's a fundamentalist, who I doubt if he reads Greek. He probably learned Greek at some time or another, but he's learned a fundamentalist way of interpreting Revelation. And he's written books since 1970. He's written books showing that the book of Revelation is indicating that Jesus is coming back soon. This is what he was saying in 1970. And so if you can take someone like that who's a fundamentalist, who has a fundamentalist approach, and if you follow what they have to say, then you'll have an understanding of Revelation, but it'll be wrong. I mean, it's just demonstrably wrong. Or you can follow what a scholar says, who's a historical scholar. Most of the views I sketch in my book, by the way, they're not atheist views or anything like that. Many of the views I sketch in this book about how to interpret Revelation are held by liberal Christian scholars, historical scholars among the Christians, who've written the best commentaries on Revelation by a long shot. And so I think what you do is you figure out, do you want to be confirmed in what you already think, that Jesus is coming back on Thursday, or do you want to have a historical understanding of the book that's based on careful study by historical scholars? If you want the latter, then you need to pick scholars to read or reference tools. What I usually suggest is people begin by simply getting a really good study Bible, not a fundamentalist study Bible, but for example, something like the HarperCollins Study Bible. Very accessible, gives you introduction to each book, explains each book, has footnotes at the bottom of the page to explain complicated passages, written by real scholars, serious scholars. Start with that and go from there.
And so this isn't sort of it's not a lost cause up front. You don't have to go off and study a couple of semesters of Greek and then go out and get Matthew Henry or Adam Clark or the pulpit commentaries or Robertson's word pictures or whatever, right? You go and
I would not do that.
Tools. Right.
I would not do that. So you get reliable tools, and I think there are online resources that people can go to as well that are by reliable historical. I suppose that I have a blog where every week, 5 times a week, I post 1,200 to 1,400 words on issues connected with the New Testament, Jesus, early Christianity. I've been doing it for 11 years. every week. And so, you get stuff like that by reliable scholars, and that's where you start, I think.
I frequent your blog, but I'm not brave enough to stick my head up and actually actually write something there. But I do enjoy your blog.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And I just want to say that I agree that studying the Bible means first getting your hands dirty in history. And that is, for me, one of the two great cures for finding a Christianity that is compatible with the humans in the world that we live with, or walking away altogether. And, the three of us, well, I guess all four of us have eventually walked away, and a little bit of history and a little bit of science. That's the other great cure. And so thank you for answering that before we dive in, because I'm really looking forward to jumping into the book.
So before we get on any further with that, let's remind the listeners that the book is Armageddon, What the Bible Really Says About the End. It's Bart's most recent book. So what I'm kind of interested in about the book, before we get into the detail of what Revelation says and what you have to say about it, what is the history of Revelation? What language is it written in, and who wrote it? Is it one author? Is it multiple authors?
Yeah, it's important to have that kind of background, because it was not written by King James. So it kind of changes things a little bit when you realize. So the book of Revelation, like the other books of the New Testament, was probably written in the first century, probably at the end of the first century. It's written in Greek. The Greek is not good. For people who are experts in Greek, it's known to be rather lousy Greek with actual grammatical mistakes. And so it's not great Greek, but that doesn't mean that the author's not intelligent. It just, in places, he doesn't write very well. Greek was the language of the Roman Empire, the broad spread language, just like English basically is the language of the Western world today. So this author is writing in Greek. His name is John. He calls himself John. He says that he's on the island of Patmos, which is a small island off the west coast of Turkey. Back then it was Asia Minor, off the west coast of Asia Minor. He says that he's there experiencing tribulation because of the word of Jesus. And historically, people have taken that to mean that he was engaged in Christian activities and got arrested and sent into exile to this island of Patmos. That may be right, but he doesn't actually say that. And there are other possibilities for why he's on Patmos, suffering for the word of God. He could be there as a missionary, for example, or we don't really know. We don't know anything about this man. Traditionally, he has been thought to be the author also of the Gospel of John, but scholars don't think so anymore. And already in the third Christian century, there were Christian intellectuals who realized that whoever wrote the book of Revelation did not write the Gospel of John, because the writing style is so radically different. We actually have a treatise that survives written around the year 260 of the Common Era, when by a Christian intellectual in Alexandria, Egypt, who shows that this author is not the same author by a linguistic analysis. In other words, by comparing the language of the two books. And he was absolutely right. His arguments still work today. It wasn't written by the same guy. So the Gospel of John was traditionally ascribed to John, the son of Zebedee, Jesus' disciple. Most scholars don't think John wrote it, but in any case, whoever wrote Revelation, we don't know anything about him other than what he says in the book.
You mentioned about the Greek that's written is poor. Now, it's been a while since I've read Revelation, because I don't habitually, since deconverting, the Bible isn't my first place to go to if I'm looking for something to read. Not anymore, anyway. But my memory of trying to read Revelation previously is that it's difficult, even in English, to read through it. A lot of imagery and a lot of the language, even in English, is quite complex and quite difficult to get to the meaning of. Could that be a feature of the bad Greek to start with, or is the language just so insane that it's hard to translate anyway?
So the English translations are better than the Greek. So when I said the Greek is bad, what I meant was just grammatically. Like there are grammatical mistakes.
Okay.
When I taught a class with I teach classics department students sometimes. I had a class on New Testament Greek a few years ago, and these students are really good at Greek. So I gave them an assignment to read Revelation chapter 1 and to identify all the grammatical errors. And they could do it. And so the problem you're having reading Revelation isn't so much the language as the imagery.
Right.
It's just strange stuff in there. And you need somebody to guide you through it in order to understand it. Because a lot of the imagery makes sense if you know enough about other ancient writings like Revelation. And most people, if you're not reading the Bible, you're probably not reading a lot of these other Jewish apocalypses either. You're probably not reading 4th Ezra and 2nd Baruch, etc. And so you have to know how this kind of imagery works to make sense of Revelation. And so you need somebody to explain it to you.
Okay.
I've got something I would love to send you. I won't ever use it again, but I think you'd find it fascinating. I had a college professor years ago, so I went to seminary, and I had a college professor who spent quite a long time diagramming the entire book of Revelation, and reading how he diagrammed the book of Revelation was fascinating. Now, but he didn't diagram it in Greek as you would at first suppose. He diagrammed it in English, and I think that same kind of exercise in Greek would be it could be fascinating for the right kind of person. But his diagramming of the book of Revelation was marvelous to read as a Bible student years ago.
Yeah. Yeah, there are some weird diagrams of Revelation. And it's one of these books that is so mystical that people want to kind of break the mystery. And one of the ways they do it is they show what the real kind of how it all fits together through coming up with this kind of diagrammic approach. Right. And there can be some strange stuff you do when you do that.
This was not less strange than the average, I promise you.
I'm sure it wasn't.
Sticking with the bad Greek that you mentioned, is there anything that can we use that to make any kind of predictions about who the author was in terms of their education level? Is it a feature of a poor education, or is it the feature of an elderly person who is maybe starting to suffer from dementia and their writing has suffered as well? Could we tell the difference between, say, those two types of individual from the writing?
I don't know that we could. I'm not sure because we don't have samples of each to compare to each other. But the scholars have long dealt with this problem of the bad writing, and the normal solution that I used to teach to my university students is that the author's primary language was probably Aramaic. In other words, a Semitic language like Jesus spoke, and that Greek was his second language. Right. And so he wasn't as good at Greek. I used to think that, and I used to teach that, but I don't think so anymore. I think that, there are a lot of really smart people in the world who just don't write well. My students at Chapel Hill they're very good students. It's hard to get into this university. And so they were all, A students in school, in high school and such. But, some of them can't write worth beans. And it's just kind of the way it is. Some people are better at writing than others, just like some people are better at math than others, or people are better at engineering than others. And so writing's a skill. And I think that there have been a number of solutions that people have proposed over the years, including, maybe he's an old man now, or maybe he's not well educated. Or he's certainly well educated. I mean, he's better educated than 95% of the rest of the ancient world. I mean, 90% of the world couldn't even read, let alone write. And so he's highly educated, but he's not as highly educated as, the really top tier of authors from the ancient world. So anyway, people have made speculations about the bad writing. My view is the guy just doesn't write very well.
One more question along that line, having to do with the overall vision of the book of Revelation, and not having to do with writing, but another one of those ideas that occasionally crop up. In some Christian rituals, there was occasional some sort of drug use. And I was reading a geology article recently where they'd found some evidence of drug use in some of these ancient sites where old Christian rituals took place. Do you think that the author of the book of Revelation, on the island of Patmos, right? Do you think that he had access to, any sort of plant that might have caused this sort of very strong vision? By the way, I'm not criticizing the author. I'm just curious about the possible history about how this vision took place.
Yeah, no, a lot of people ask me that, and some people say that, they actually understand Revelation better when they're stoned. So,
see, this has gone very autobiographical for me now.
Okay. So I'm not a big fan of the people who are arguing that drugs are used a lot in ancient Christianity. I don't think they're, I know people argue that. I repeatedly have people ask me whether John was eating some kind of weird mushrooms or something, but I don't think so. The thing is that Revelation seems so weird and bizarre to us because it's the only, if we read it, it's about the only book we ever have read that is like this. And it just sounds like somebody's on drugs here. But the reality is, and one of the things I try to emphasize in my talking about the book and teaching about the book and writing about the book, is that this kind of book was common in Jewish and Christian circles at the time. For us, it's a kind of a one-off, but for ancient Jews and Christians, they would have recognized what kind of book this is, with these bizarre visions, with highly symbolic that are involve wild beasts and crazy things happening, catastrophes striking the earth one after the other, and that kind of thing that strikes us as crazy was kind of typical of the genre. And so the one way to think of it is that if you took any science fiction novel today and transported it back a couple hundred years, nobody would understand what in the world is this thing. Oh my God, this is weird. And, but today you pick up a science fiction novel, you know perfectly well what it is. This is just, okay, it's a science fiction novel. And, but to an outsider, it would seem weird. And that's what the book of Revelation is like. If you know how apocalypses work, that's the name of this ancient genre, apocalypse. If you knew how apocalypses work, then John, you wouldn't think this author's on drugs. You just think this is how, he's writing an apocalypse. This is how you write an apocalypse.
That seems consistent to me with misunderstanding a book, and then because it's misunderstood, trying to find some reason for the misunderstanding without digging into it.
And when I was a fundamentalist, when we read the book, it was so weird. We said, "Oh my God, no human could come up with this. This must be inspired by God."
Right. In fact, we just interviewed a guest who wrote an entire book about verisimilitude. Verisimilitude in the Old and New Testament. It's just a defense of you can't make this stuff up, so it must be true.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, people who write verisimilitude know that people are going to think that. That's why they use verisimilitude.
Right.
You have people. I mean, it's all over the place in the New Testament. You have people who seriously argue that when Jesus feeds the 5,000 in the book of Mark, he says that they sat down on green grass, or something like that, and they'll say, "How would an author possibly know it was green? It must show that he was there." What? You ever read a novel before?
So that kind of thing does happen, and I particularly, Matthew, if we can get into the book now, one of the things that I thought was cleverly done in Armageddon was the discussion of how prophecy works, right? And so I don't know that that's the place we want to start, but I do want to talk about, as we progress, what makes prophecy in Revelation look so convincing, and how the mechanism of prophecy might actually work, right? There's a lot of really good material in Armageddon talking about prophecy. So Matthew, where do we start?
No, carry on with that. I'll clear up your question and we'll carry on.
Okay, so Bart, one of the big questions about the book of Revelation is it prophecy, and if so, what kind? What did Jesus think about the end of days? What did the first century church think about the end of days? And where are we today, and how does that differ from what either Jesus thought or the first century church thought? And so hopefully that'll give us a good jumping off place.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yeah. What I'm going to say would apply probably either to Jesus or to John of Patmos. But when you're dealing with the book of Revelation, it's quite clear that John is expecting that his predictions are going to come soon. He thinks that something is going to happen that is going to be a huge catastrophe, and the whore of Babylon is going to be destroyed, and there's going to be this battle of Armageddon where all the armies of earth are wiped out, and God's going to bring in a new kingdom for all of his followers. And in the last chapter, he 6 times repeats it's going to be soon. Today, there are a lot of people who insist it's going to be soon. Fundamentalist Christians continue to insist it's going to be soon. And they say, see, John says it's going to be soon. Right. Wait a second. John was writing 2,000 years ago. And so when he says soon, John is explicitly writing to 7 churches in the western part of Asia Minor. And so these are 7 churches in 7 different towns and cities on the west coast of Turkey. And he names them. It's places like Thyatira and Smyrna and Laodicea. These are cities, and there's a Christian church in these places. And John knows these people, and he's writing to them, and he's explaining what's soon to happen. When he says soon, he means soon for them. He's writing to them. Authors always write for their audience. Sure. And so it would make no sense for John to tell them to, be ready for it because it's going to happen soon if he really means it's going to happen, in 2,000 years. Of course, Christians have always dealt with this in a number of different ways. One of the ways it's fairly standard is people say, well, soon is by God's calendar, not by human calendars. And with the Lord, a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as one day, as 2 Peter says. And to that, I always reply that, yeah, okay, that's great. So if you really think that Jesus is coming in 3 days, we can start looking for him in 5023. Because it's going to be soon. Right. So anyway, so John does think something's big's going to happen, but he doesn't think that it's going to be that that Russia is going to invade Israel and that the Europeans are going to get involved and that then the U.S. is going to start dropping bombs or whatever. I mean, it's like these scenarios you get today are not what he had in mind.
So that was an interesting discussion about Lindsay in the book and attack helicopters and nuclear weapons and all of that sort of thing, and why that sort of imagery of today doesn't work under close investigation of the book of Revelation, right? So it's fine to sort of blue sky whatever you think this sort of imagery might mean, but it doesn't appear from reading Armageddon that today's imagery having to do with the whore of Babylon can possibly relate to today. So walk us through some of that, unless Matthew objects, because I think Matthew's actually got a script, and I'm pretty sure I'm pretty sure.
No, carry on, Andrew. No, it's fine. Carry on.
It's really a key point because as Matthew and I were talking about it, the book of Revelation is so full of imagery and symbolism that, unless you get unless you see what it is, unless somebody tells you what it is and you figure it out, then it usually doesn't make sense. But there's some things in Revelation that actually, once you get them explained to you, they really make perfect sense. And so just to take, for example, this figure called the whore of Babylon in chapter 17 of Revelation, John, one of John's visions is he's taken into a wilderness by an angel, and he's shown this horrific vision. There's this ghastly woman who is clad in this finery, this really fancy clothing with jewels and gold and silver, but she's this grotesque woman, and she's got a gold cup in her hand, and she's drunk with the abominations of her fornication, whatever that means, and she's drunk with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus, and she's sitting on a beast that has 7 heads and 10 horns. And this beast in this wilderness, 7 heads, 10 horns, she's sitting on it, and on her head is written a name, Babylon the Great, the mother of whores. What in the world? Now, if you're reading this in the King James, it's really interesting because when John sees this vision, the author reports that John looked upon her with great admiration. Wow. In the King James version. And so this is a place where, like, the King James is written so long ago. Admiration in the early 17th century meant astonishment. And so
Ah.
John is astonished, and he's not admiring
Yeah.
her. And so what is this thing? And what happens in these books, these apocalypses, like Revelation, but like other apocalypses at the time, is you almost always have an angel standing by to explain what's going on here. And so you have to pay attention to what the angel says. So the woman has the name Babylon written on her head. Babylon is the name of the city in the Old Testament, hundreds of years earlier, that had destroyed Jerusalem, God's city, Jerusalem, and burned the temple down. And so this woman is named Babylon, named after the city. The angel tells John that the beast that she's sitting on has 7 heads, because those are the 7 hills that Babylon is seated on. Now, in the ancient world, everybody knew what city was built on 7 hills. It's Rome, still called that, the Rome built on 7 hills. And in case you're not getting it, at the end, the angel says the woman is the city that is fornicating with all the nations of the earth and dominating the earth. Well, what city in John's day was dominating the earth? The city of Rome. Why is she called Babylon? Because Rome also destroyed the Jerusalem and burned the temple. And she's drunk with the blood of martyrs because Rome started persecuting the Christians under Nero and martyred a number of them. And so it all fits together. This is talking about the city of Rome in John's day. It's not talking about, when in the 70s we thought it was talking about the Soviet Union. Today people still think it's talking about Russia, or it's talking about this, that, or the other thing. No, just read it in its historical context and see what the angel says, and it's clear this is talking about Rome.
Is it fair to say then that at this point in time, the author had either been living in or knew people who'd been living under Rome? And is it fair to call it oppression for multiple decades, 50 or more years?
It's certainly clear that the author believed that the Roman Empire was persecuting Christians and creating a lot of martyrs. It's not clear that that's historically correct, but the author certainly saw it that way. Today, when I teach my classes at Chapel Hill, many of my Christian students will tell me that they are persecuted as Christians. And I just scratch my head. What? In the American South, you're a Christian, you feel persecuted? And, who's running the government down here anyway?
Yes.
It ain't the atheists, let me tell you. So Christianity has long had this kind of thing, that the way Christianity constructs itself is as a persecuted sect. And that was certainly true in the first century, and often it was persecuted. But there were not thousands and thousands of martyrs the way John portrays.
Is it fair to say then that imagery of Christian persecution, because it's ended up in the Bible, has survived and perpetrated that kind of mindset?
It has contributed to perpetrating it. And it's, I think it might even be more deeply rooted than just the fact that it's in the New Testament. Christianity is a religion that's based on a martyrdom. Jesus was killed by the authorities, and the early apostles are said to have, had trouble with the authorities in the New Testament. So it is all in the New Testament. But the very idea of Christianity, that one will suffer for the truth, is deeply bedded in Christianity. And so Christians have tended to think that if they're holding to the truth, they're being persecuted.
Yes, the phrase "I must bear my cross" is something that I'm very familiar with, and I've had conversations where that phrase has been used many, many times in my Christian life.
Well, my experience, very few Christians do bear their cross. Most Christians want to dominate other people rather than suffer and serve other people. And that's part of the point of my book, as you know, at the end of the book, where I say that, this author Revelation is not talking about bearing your cross. He's talking about dominating the nations of earth with a rod of iron. Very different.
Yes, Suze, that is something that you do bring up on that. So, but what I'd like to ask a little bit is, you talk about the Armageddon and stuff going on and the apocalyptic nature of the literature, and then you make a brief reference over to Daniel. What is the relationship between Daniel and Revelation in that context?
Right. So the book of Daniel it's one of the Old Testament books that in English Bibles it's included among the prophets. it turns out that the book is kind of like Revelation in a lot of ways. So the book of Daniel's in 12 chapters. The first 6 chapters tell short stories about this fellow Daniel, who was a exile to the city of Babylon after Babylon destroyed Jerusalem. And then chapters 7 through 12 are his visionary experiences, where he too sees bizarre visions involving beasts and wild things going on that are predicting what's going to happen in the future. The book claims to be written by this fellow Daniel in the 6th century BCE, in the 500s before Christ. But scholars have long known, they've known this from antiquity, that the book was actually written in the 2nd century BCE by somebody claiming to be someone who lived in the 6th century. And so this person is claiming to be someone who was predicting the future, but he's living after most of these events have happened. So it's not too hard to predict the future because he knows they've already happened. So he has these bizarre images of beasts coming up out of the sea and dominating the earth, and the holy ones of God the Israelites being persecuted. The author John of Patmos had that book, knew it, and based many of his images on the book of Daniel. And so you can actually see very close parallels between Daniel and Revelation, because the author of Revelation used Daniel as one of the kind of models for how he wanted to describe his own things to come in his own book.
So that will be why Babylon is mentioned in both and things like that then.
Yeah, and this, when I mentioned the beast that this whore of Babylon is sitting on. Elsewhere in Revelation, you have this beast from the sea, who's this horrible beast that takes over the earth, just like the beast in Daniel chapter 7 takes over the earth. In Revelation, this is the figure that most people identify as the Antichrist. The word Antichrist is not used in the book of Revelation, but this is the opponent of Christ, and so the term Antichrist makes some sense there. But it's based on the beast of the sea found in the book of Daniel. And so Revelation is alluding back to that earlier writing.
So for the modern equivalent, then it'll be like historical fiction.
Yeah, well, kind of. It's more like, how do you put it? It's really more like science fiction, frankly. Okay. It's these visions of things that a person's telling you are going to happen and meant to actually have some effect on you. So, for example, you might have a post-apocalyptic novel about the climate collapsing, and a few people survive living on the barren earth. And it'll be predicting what's going to happen, or a post-apocalyptic novel about nuclear exchange, where there's only a few people left. And so these books they're in some way they're kind of projecting what's going to happen, but they're also saying a lot about what's going on now. Like, you really don't want nuclear exchange. We need to do something about this. Or you really don't want the climate to collapse. So you need to do something about it now. And Revelation, I would say, is more like that, rather than a historical fiction. Like, you can write a historical fictional novel on Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson's a real guy in the novel, but you come up with a fictional part of it, and it isn't really quite that. It's more like a science fiction-y thing.
Okay, so it's kind of like Abraham Lincoln Vampire Hunter, if you've seen that film.
Yeah, except for yeah, right. It's like that, but yeah, but the Abraham Lincoln's a real person, and the whore of Babylon is not.
No, it's not. Yes, of course. Yeah.
See what I mean?
Yeah. Key point. So when Daniel then was included in the Old Testament, did the people who put it there know this, or did they make an honest mistake?
No, they didn't know. They thought that it was written by somebody named Daniel living in the 6th century BCE.
Right.
But there were scholars already in the 2nd century of the Common Era who said, no, it could not have been written then. It had to be written during the Maccabean revolt in the 160s BCE. And they proved it, and it's absolutely right. It was written when the nation of Israel was suffering severe persecution under a Syrian monarch called Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was the arch enemy of God. And he made it illegal for Jews to practice their Judaism in Israel, and there was a Jewish uprising against him, and the book of Daniel was written in that particular context.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Andrew. You had something you wanted to say?
Well, I can hear our conservative listeners, both of them, whoever they are. But I can hear them pounding on the desk right now and saying, okay, right. But here's why the Book of Revelation isn't like Isaac Asimov's Foundation series or Robert Heinlein's Time for the Stars or Larry Niven's Ringworld or whatever. Here's why it's not like those things. And the reason it's not is because those people know that they're writing science fiction. And we don't think that John of Patmos was making a remote effort to write something like the fiction of his day. And so I'm wondering what you think there, Bart, because that would have been my response to you as a Christian. It's not my response today, but that's what I'd have said then, right? You can think that it's science fiction, but John is writing from the heart and from a legitimate connection with God, and not from not from the hope of selling his science fiction book to Bayan or whatever, right? So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, I agree with that. It's not a science fiction novel. It's is written long before there were science fiction novels. Science fiction novels they're very different. When I say it's like a science fiction novel, I'm emphasizing the word like, because it's the closest thing we have, because you're dealing with creatures who are above the earth, not on the earth. You have to travel to where they are up above, and they are far more intelligent, more powerful than beings on earth, and they are threatening earth and are possibly going to destroy the earth. And so it is it's certainly, it's not like Asimov per se, but something like the War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds, is it's kind of a secular version of the Apocalypse of John in a sense. And so clearly John's not writing to make a profit. He's not, he's writing something he sincerely believes. I absolutely agree with that. And he doesn't mean it he doesn't, it's not the same as writing a modern fiction. That's right. But he does know that he's describing things in highly symbolic terms. Using those highly symbolic terms, he means something specific about them. And the key to understanding Revelation is to recognize that these symbolic terms are not to be taken literally. There's not literally going to be this disaster, that disaster, and that disaster. Because if you understand it that way, if you try to understand Revelation that way as a literal description of what's going to happen, as opposed to, kind of a symbolic description, the book will make no sense to you. One reason it'll make no sense is because it's set up to be a series of disasters that are going to strike the earth. One of the early disasters in this book is that the sun turns black, the moon turns to blood, stars fall to earth, and the sky is rolled up like a scroll. And you think, well, okay, the universe is ending now, right? Yeah, well, you would think that, but you're only in chapter 6. You got 4 chapters to go here. And so you can't take it literally as that happening, because there wouldn't be any earth left. And so my point is really that it isn't, I'm not trying to be hung up on the genre of science fiction at all. I'm just saying it's kind of like that. It's using this kind of wild stuff to try and say something.
Right. And I knew that you weren't trying to compare it to science fiction of the time, but the thing that I was hoping to get was what you just got to, right? That even John, and for me, this was a really important part of Armageddon, right? Was reading your book, was to understand that even the author understood that he was writing in figures, right?
Yeah.
And so once you walk away with that, once that's in your back pocket, it's a lot easier to embark on any investigation of the Book of Revelation once you understand that even the author knew that he was writing very symbolically. And so I appreciated that part of the book, and that's what I wanted to tease out. So thank you.
Yeah, well, no, I think it's an important point, because I wouldn't say even the author. I'd say precisely the author. I mean, that is what he's doing. He's writing precisely in order to present a symbolic narrative that needs to be interpreted and not taken literally.
So who's he writing for? Who's the target audience for this form of literature? Who enjoys reading that kind of thing at that time?
So as I pointed out, there are a range of books like this, apocalypses, that are written by Jewish authors before John, and by Christian authors and Jewish authors after John. These tended to be books that were written in times where people felt that this world was being controlled by powerful forces beyond their control, that were wicked and were opposed to God, and that those who were on God's side were therefore suffering. And the books were meant to be symbolic statements that even though it's very, very bad now, and even though it's probably going to get worse, in the end, God is going to triumph. And so if you're on the right side, if you're on the side of God, you're going to be rewarded, and all of your enemies are going to be horribly destroyed. And so for people who either really are suffering or who sense that they're suffering, these books are meant to provide some kind of hope that in fact that God is going to triumph in the end, and that good will prevail, and that you will be rewarded in the end. And so when John writes, specifically, he's writing to Christians of these 7 churches of Asia Minor. The striking thing about the book of Revelation is that virtually everybody on earth gets wiped out. The people who survive are those who are very, very committed followers of Christ, but they're followers of Christ who are followers of Christ like John is a follower of Christ. He indicates when he writes to these churches that a number of the Christians in these churches are also going to be wiped out. They don't have the right kind of Christianity. And so, man, it's off to the lake of fire for them. And so it isn't that this is providing hope for all Christians. It's providing a hope for a very tiny slice of Christians who agree with John of Patmos, and everyone else, Christian, Jew, and pagan, is going to be destroyed.
To what extent is it apparent to you as a scholar that John was aware of say, the writings of Paul, or the writings of Peter, or the writings of any other influential member of the Christian church at the time? So the point I'm driving at is, does John's view of the end of days sort of match with Paul or Peter, right? To what extent is John a unifying force or a destructive force in the voices of the early church?
There are a lot of aspects to that question. It's a very important one. And I would say that kind of 2 big aspects are, what had he actually read? Had he ever read any of Paul's writings or any of the Gospels or anything like that? Is one issue. And the other issue is he basically on saying similar things as these others, which he could do without having read them. I don't personally think that John had read any of the other books of the New Testament that came into the New Testament. He may have, but if he did, then I don't think, I would say he doesn't show any evidence of having read them. And so I'm not sure that he did. There have been scholars who have argued that he was familiar with the writings of Paul. Elaine Pagels, a fine scholar, has argued that in her book, Revelations, and I think it's wrong. I don't agree with her on this. I don't think there's evidence that John knew Paul's writings. Did he have a similar view of what was going to happen at the end? Broadly speaking, most early Christians of the first century understood that they were living at the end of the age, and that the end was coming soon, and that Jesus was going to come back from heaven to destroy his enemies and set up a kingdom on earth. Paul thought that, and I think most of the authors of the New Testament thought that, as did John. Jesus himself thought that the end was coming soon. I don't think that Jesus himself thought that he himself was coming back. Jesus predicted that another figure was going to come and to judge the earth. But so they're all kind of aligned that way. But there are other ways that they really are not aligned. John, the Apocalypse of John really stands out in other ways in the New Testament, but not in the sense that this apocalyptic vision in some way is going to happen.
There's something so tantalizing right there that I can't avoid it, that Jesus thought that another figure was coming in judgment. I can't let it go, man. Again, I hear the voices
Yeah, so do I. Yeah, so we could easily spend a 2-hour episode on this one. Let me tell you, this is one
You
of
are
the
welcome
thorniest
here
problems.
anytime.
That sounded
Okay,
like you want to come back.
it is. I'll tell
Welcome here
you.
anytime.
Well, it is complicated, this one. So the deal is this. In the Gospels, Jesus predicts that a figure called the Son of Man is going to be arriving from heaven in judgment on the earth, and that whoever has rejected Jesus' teachings will be wiped out by the Son of Man. This phrase, Son of Man, ultimately goes back to the book of Daniel that we were mentioning earlier. Daniel chapter 7, verses 13 and 14. I said that Daniel has these beasts coming out of the sea. There's 4 beasts. They come one after the other. They take over the earth. They're horrible, terrible beasts. But then the one like a son of man comes on the clouds of heaven, and the beasts are wiped out. And this one like a son of man is given the kingdom of God on earth. Okay. There were Jewish apocalypticists around, people who believed in the coming apocalypse. So Jewish apocalypticists believing in the coming apocalypse before Christianity, who appear to have thought that this one like a son of man would be an individual, some kind of divine judge of the earth. In the Gospels of the New Testament, Jesus clearly talks about himself as the Son of Man.
Mm.
And so that's why the people who are faithful Bible reading Christians will say, well, Jesus wasn't talking about someone else. In the Gospels, he says the Son of Man is coming back, and he identifies himself as the Son of Man. So he's talking about himself coming back in judgment. This is where it gets difficult and down in the weeds. I fully agree that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, Jesus speaks of himself as the Son of Man, and he talks about the Son of Man who's coming in judgment. Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written 40, 50, 60 years after Jesus himself. And based on historical scholarship, there are debates among scholars about whether Jesus actually called himself the Son of Man.
Mm-hmm.
He does call himself that in the Gospels written many decades later. My view is that there are some sayings of Jesus. Okay, sorry, here we go in the weeds, but I'm going to try and make this as clear as I can. In some of the sayings of Jesus, Jesus talks about the Son of Man coming to judge the earth. In those particular sayings about the Son of Man, he does not seem to identify himself as the Son of Man.
Interesting.
For example, Mark chapter 8, verse 38, Jesus says, whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of that person, the Son of Man will be ashamed when he comes on the clouds of heaven in the presence of the holy angels. Now, if you already think Jesus is the Son of Man, that he knows he's the Son of Man, that he calls himself the Son of Man, then what he's saying is, who's ever ashamed of me now, I'll be ashamed when I come on the clouds of heaven. But if you just look at that saying, that isn't what he says. He says, whoever is ashamed of me, the Son of Man will be ashamed. That one will be ashamed of. He doesn't say, I will be ashamed of. I think Jesus did talk about the Son of Man as someone other than himself. But what happened was, when Jesus got crucified, his followers believed he got raised from the dead and was taken up to heaven. So they came to think that he was the one that had been predicted. He's the man in heaven now, and he's coming back. And so they started identifying himself as the Son of Man and started claiming that he identified himself as the Son of Man. But I don't think he did. Is that too much in the weeds?
No, I am. I love the nuance there, and this is why, for everyone listening, gathering a toolbox of critical thinking tools and doing the hard yards, right? Really getting in. If you're going to stake your life and your reputation on this book and this central figure, then you owe it to yourself to be as nuanced in your study as the book is nuanced in its own pages. So that's fascinating, and thank you.
That was really useful. I'm having pity on my Christian self, because if I'd heard you say that while I was still a Christian, I'd have had a bucket load of cognitive dissonance and I wouldn't have known what to do with it.
Well, you said I'm crazy.
Probably.
What's that talking about?
I'd have had to find some way to rule you out
Yeah.
because
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. No, I get it. I would have too.
That was, man, thank you for that.
You're welcome.
That was, I'll be pointing back to that in future episodes. I'm positive. That was beautifully done.
Sticking in the New Testament for a bit, there's a couple of things I've been asked to bring up to you, because obviously when someone like yourself is coming onto this podcast, I find it hard to keep it quiet. So I have been asked regarding the Gospels for an explanation of the Olivet Discourse and how that fits in with the apocalyptic nature of Revelation and Jesus' thoughts on Revelation, etc., or the apocalypse rather.
Yeah. So in the Gospels, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, before Jesus is arrested, he gives a long speech at the end. In Mark, it's chapter 13. In Matthew, it's chapters 24 and 25, and it's on the Mount of Olives, and so it's called the Olivet Discourse. Scholars, in fact, I haven't heard that term for a very long time. Scholars call it. I think that scholars tend to call it the apocalyptic discourse, Jesus' apocalyptic discourse.
Okay.
And it is Jesus' own way of explaining what's going to happen at the end, using language about what's going to happen when at the end of time, when all hell breaks out here on earth. Natural disasters, catastrophes, one thing after the other, and then the Son of Man is going to come from heaven to destroy the enemies. And so people need to be ready for this coming of the Son of Man. Disciples want to know when that, okay, they hear all this, and then they ask Jesus, okay, so when's it going to be? And Jesus has this line. This is Matthew 25, where Jesus says, no one knows the day or the hour when it'll happen. But he says, learn the lesson from the fig tree. When the fig tree puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. So too, when these things take place, you know that the Son of Man is near. He's at the very gate. Truly, I tell you, this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. This is a very important verse for me for a lot of reasons. When I was a fundamentalist, I accepted the view that this was indicating that Jesus had to return by 1988. You went, how do you get 1988 out of that? Well, fundamentalists did, and there were books written on it. Hal Lindsey held to this. And the argument was that Jesus is giving a parable. Fig tree puts forth its leaves, the summer is near. Okay, what's the fig tree? In the Bible, the fig tree represents Israel. Israel is likened to a fig tree that has to bear fruit. If it doesn't bear good fruit, God's going to cut it down. So the fig tree, Israel, has put forth its leaves. What does that mean? Well, Israel is laying dormant during the winter, and now it comes back to life. Okay, so when does Israel come back to life? 1948. Israel becomes a sovereign state again in 1948. All right. Jesus says this generation will not pass away before all these things take place. How long is a generation in the Bible? 40 years. There it is. 1948 plus 40. Bingo. 1988. And so we all knew it had to happen in 1988. And so that's how passages like that get misused. But if you're doing it from a historical perspective, you don't do it that way. You try and figure out what the symbolism means. I'm not sure I've answered this person's question about the Olivet Discourse, but those are some thoughts on it.
I'll probably get feedback if they feel they'd like it more dealt with. But I'm obviously ill-equipped to answer the question on your behalf, so we'll have to see what happens.
All right.
Andrew, did you have a follow-up?
I think it's fascinating just how often these kinds of things fail. I'm not trying to drive us off in the weeds, and I'm afraid this will, but it's fascinating how often these sort of end-time predictions fail and how there are evangelicals still in the business of making the predictions, right? And so at some point, somebody's going to be right. But so, somebody's going to get it right. Of course, since I don't think there's a God, as far as I can tell, the Earth's going to come to an end, and they're still not going to get what they want. But it is fascinating to me that as much of this has been wrong, there are still people willing to go out publicly and make these really definitive statements that, now I've got the math right, and oh boy, you watch out.
Yeah. Well, I deal with that a lot in my book. And I actually begin with an anecdote about 1988 because I moved to Chapel Hill to teach here in 1988.
Mhm.
And I arrived here in August and unpacked my office. And I got a phone call from a local journalist who wanted to know if it was true that Jesus was coming back between September 11th and 13th next month. and, and it wasn't just Hal Lindsey. There was a guy who'd written a book called 88 Reasons Why the Rapture Will Be in 1988. And this fellow had narrowed it down. It was going to be during the Jewish festival of Rosh Hashanah in September of that year. And so I had to tell this reporter, yeah, it ain't going to happen. And he was a bit disappointed. But I said, well, it's okay, because if it does happen, if I'm wrong about this, then, either you're not going to be around to worry about it, or you're going to have 7 years of tribulation, which would be great news reportage for you.
When I read that early on in the book, the first thing that popped into my mind was, what did the journalist do with your answer? So I was fascinated that he called you, right? Because he's called somebody that's in the know, right? He's done a good job of finding an expert. And I thought, that's good journalism. Not like the right-wing news channels okay, not like the right-wing news channels. Sorry, guys. So he's done a good job. He's gotten in touch with an expert. Did he write? I'm just curious. Did he write your conversation down? Did he editorialize it anywhere?
Oh, now that's a great question, and I don't know the answer to it. I don't think I followed up on it because I just, I said, look, it ain't gonna happen. And so I couldn't tell, in fact, whether he was a conservative Christian himself, who thought that the rapture was coming at some point, and wondered if that this proved it, or if he was instead just somebody who had heard this, wanted kind of a soundbite on it.
Right.
Yeah,
because it would have been front page news if you'd said, "Oh yeah, it's probably going to happen." It would have been all over the front page.
That was big, yeah. Well, the funny thing is, this guy Edgar Weissner, who wrote the book, predicts September 11th to the 13th, and he had fundamentalists who were all over him for it, who said, "Look, Jesus himself says you don't know the day or the hour." And why? But Weissner wasn't fazed by this. He said, "Well, yeah, no," he said, "I don't know the day or the hour. I just know the week." And of course, when it didn't happen in 1988, then he wrote another book saying, "Oh my God, I made a mistake. Sorry, I forgot there is no year zero. You go from 1 BC to 1 AD, right? Yes. There's no year zero." He says, "I'm off by a year. It's 1989." So there's no stopping some people.
No, and you did relay a story where someone eventually, I don't remember who it was, my apologies, but someone did finally give up and get out of the business of trying to discern the exact, the sort of exact year or month or week or whatever. Who was that?
Was that Harold Camping?
It was Harold Camping, yeah. And
gotcha.
Harold Camping, many people remember Harold Camping today because he had predicted that the end was coming on May 21st, 2011. What many people don't know is that in 1992, I think it was, he wrote a book, a very big 550-page book, proving that the end was going to come in 1996. He picked a date in 1996. It's like March 21st or something. It didn't happen. So then he said, "Oh, I'm at September 21st." That didn't happen. So October 21st. That didn't happen. Then he gave up on 1996. And later in life, then he went on this 2011 thing, and again had to reset the date 3 times. And finally, by the end of it, he just gave up and said, "Oh, everybody told me I was wrong to do this," all of his evangelical friends. He says, "It turns out I was wrong. I need to repent of my sins because I shouldn't have done that." And he died 2 years later as a really unhappy man because he really thought Jesus was coming back.
Oh, that's sad. The fact that he died with some amount of regret is that's sad.
But it's what happens, when you make predictions. They're going to be wrong. Right. Revelation's not talking about that. The key to understand Revelation, it's not talking about our future. And when you predict it's talking about our future, then you're just getting it wrong. It's not because you've got the date wrong, or that you misunderstood a particular verse or got one symbol incorrect. It's the entire approach to Revelation is wrong.
Right.
Yes, right. And the secret to predictions is obviously making it far enough into the future that you won't be alive to find out that you're wrong. That's clearly the right way to go about it.
Well, what a lot of evangelicals have done, because of these date setters, a lot of evangelicals have simply settled on it's going to be soon and we don't know when.
Yeah.
That's you can't prove that wrong, so that's a safer way to do it. And that's what most do today. But most continue to convince evangelical and fundamentalist readers that that's what the Bible says. And once again, it's just wrong. The Bible does not talk about our future. And I know it's hard for people to accept that, and they think, oh, of course it does. No, you just think it does because people have told you that. But in fact, it does not. It doesn't.
Yeah, and I think there's actually something quite insidious about that, because as a young child growing up in a missionary culture, that was part of my education. At school, being taught by missionary teachers almost weekly, it was a constant reminder. Jesus could come any day. It might be tomorrow. It might be next week. It might be on your next birthday. And it almost instills a level of existential fear into preteens. And I think it's quite a psychologically unhealthy environment in which to bring children up in.
It's created huge damage. It's damaged a lot of people. I know a lot of people who were evangelicals when I was, who were just psychologically damaged by it. And I don't know if in your circles, Matthew, but here in America, this movie, Thief in the Night, was a big deal back in the 70s. And this was an account of what happens when people don't survive the rapture. So Jesus comes back and takes his followers out of the world, and then the Antichrist rises up and all chaos hits the earth. And this movie was meant to terrify. It was a very, very low budget movie that was meant to terrify evangelicals. And everyone I know back then saw the movie about 20 times. And most of them had a very bad experience where they'd come home after school or something, and their parents wouldn't be home, and they'd think the rapture had happened and they'd been left behind. And it seriously damaged some of these people.
The effect of that movie comes up quite a lot in deconstruction forums. I have no memory of seeing it, so I'm hoping that I never saw it. But I do know the song of the same title so well that I could probably recite it word for word.
Well, it's worth seeing. I saw it again when I was writing my book. I thought, I got to see that again. Oh man, is it a terrible movie? It is so bad. I'll tell you an anecdote that isn't in my book. So it's a movie that everybody, who used to be an evangelical makes fun of now. So when I was in graduate school, I had already left evangelicalism. I was a very liberal Christian, kind of heading toward agnosticism. And there was a pool party with a bunch of friends of mine. And we had all been former evangelicals, and we're sitting around the pool and talking about our evangelical past. And somebody brought up Thief in the Night. We started making fun of it. There's this figure in the movie who's the minister, he's a liberal minister who preaches that the second coming isn't ever going to happen, and he gets left behind. And so he's one of those, he realizes that he made a mistake. Oh my God, I was wrong, And so we were all making fun of this movie, making fun of the minister, and we finished. And there's one guy at the pool who's a graduate student, friend of mine at Princeton University, and he's sitting by the pool. He hadn't been saying anything, even though he too had been a evangelical. And when we finished, he said, yeah. He said, actually, my father was the actor who played the minister.
Wow. No way.
Oh, my God. Wow. Whoa. That's good.
There's an autograph opportunity.
Could have told us that a few minutes ago.
Wow. I know. Whoa.
It's not just young kids. I mean, I had some bad moments as a kid. I grew up, Bart, I grew up in a mixed Baptist Methodist household, but eventually went to the Church of Christ. So if you can imagine the sort of whips. Yeah. You heard that, Tony. Oh, you're one of those. Yeah, I was. Yeah. I was one of those, but I found my way out. But my parents, they still believe, deeply believe in the rapture. And so I tell this little bit of autobiography because it just fits here. They actually sit on the couch today. They could be doing it right now, I kid you not. They sit on the couch and hold hands and wait for the rapture. And I don't mean they do it for hours on end or anything like that. I'm not, this is just part of them sort of hoping for the future. And so the damage that does.
Yeah. And that's not good. It's not good.
Yeah.
Part of my book, I talk about how the rapture is not taught in the Bible at all. These passages that are used to describe the rapture are not talking about Jesus coming back to save his people out of the world. I did a course recently actually called Will You Be Left Behind? A History of the Rapture. And so if people are interested in this kind of thing, I've got this website called, it's just my name, bartehrman.com, where I do these courses. And I did this course on this rapture, and I showed where the rapture came from. And this doesn't come from me. It's not like I found this out. This is common knowledge among historical scholars that the idea of a rapture was invented in 1833. We actually know when and who invented it and why he invented it and how it became the standard doctrine within evangelical and fundamentalist Christianity, because no Bible reader prior to that had ever found a rapture in the New Testament, and it's because it's not there, but it got put there by John Newman Darby in 1833. It became the standard view. So there are people, Andrew, like you're saying, who are just eagerly waiting for it. So it's
and they miss their grandchildren, right? They've got grandchildren that are growing up today, and those moments, I guess they're just scattered out, and you couldn't really collect them all into a block of time where it would be useful to spend the time with someone. But the point is that whatever they're doing with that time, when they're thinking about the rapture, they're not engaged in living their lives, right? They're not using those moments to come up with ways to engage with the world that they're in. And one of the things that you talked about in the book is how substantially this sort of end times thinking has contributed to conservative evangelicals dismissing the state of the world that we're in, hoping for a better one later on. And that is part of their story, and so important to this sort of premillennial thinking, right? That if you're willing to trade this world in because the end is coming in a generation or two. I think in your book you maybe said 4 generations, right? If you really think we've got 80 years or 160 years, what use is conservation?
Yeah. It's been statistically shown that, there have been studies of this kind of thing, that the expectation that Jesus is coming back soon, however you define that, does have an effect on how people, what kind of concerns they have about what the government does, what kind of social agenda we have. The most obvious one now is climate change, where it's not a surprise that so many evangelicals and fundamentalists don't believe that there's any way we're going to ruin the planet, because God's going to take care of that. He's going to send Jesus back. So they not only don't support governmental attempts to cut down on emissions and carbon footprints and things, but they're actually opposed to it. And they think that it's some people think that it's a denial of faith to think that we have to be good stewards of the planet. That's dangerous stuff. That is really dangerous stuff.
Yeah.
I remember having the distinct attitude of there's no way that man could destroy the earth, because God wouldn't let man destroy the earth, because he'll come before that happens. And it definitely changed my outlook on the kind of things that you're talking about.
Yeah. Well, and nuclear exchange. I mean, why worry about it? It's not going to, it's not going to let us do that. Wow. Right. Okay. Yeah. It's like my, I knew a woman when I was a fundamentalist whose birth control strategy was, well, if God wants me to get pregnant, I will. She was married. And God wanted to get pregnant a lot, turns out.
Yeah.
This is one of those places where you know how the mind, how the Christian mind works, and Pascal's wager is introduced here, right? Very often, well, Christianity, even if it's wrong, it's a good way to live. Okay, fine. But when you think about something like nuclear arms release, right? I almost want to introduce that sort of Pascalian reasoning, right? And just say, okay, but if your Christianity is wrong,
Yeah.
If your Christianity is wrong, what is the harm in just being good to this ball that we live on?
Yeah. The comforting news is that a lot of younger evangelicals are taking social issues like that far more seriously. And the thing is that there are easy ways to argue for that from the Bible itself. If God in the book of Genesis gave humans dominion over the earth, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've got to, just abuse it for your own sake. It means it could also mean you're supposed to be a good steward of it. God ordered Adam and Eve to take care of the Garden of Eden, not to destroy it. You can make biblical arguments. And so there's some movement that way, at least among younger evangelicals, to take issues like the climate situation more seriously.
Right. Indeed.
I've got one more serious question from somebody I know before we lighten the mood and think about a wind down. I've been asked to ask you where preterism fits within the context of Revelation and the apocalyptic narrative.
Preterism. And here I've been trying to use, without using big words. Preterism. Okay. So actually a lot of people know this view. There have been historically a variety of ways of interpreting the book of Revelation. The futuristic way that people do today, that it's predicting what's going to happen in our future, cropped up sometimes throughout the history of the church, but fairly rarely. And now it's the dominant view, the Revelation's predicting our future. But for most of Christian history, it was not the dominant view at all. Most of Christian history held to the idea that the book of Revelation was indicating what was going on now in the life of Christianity, that the millennium predicted in Revelation, where Christ rules the earth, is taking place now through the church, where Christ is ruling the church and ruling the world through the church. And so the world, is taking over the world. The church will be taking over the world because that's what's predicted about the rule of the saints in Revelation. So that's a way of understanding it in a kind of a historical way. The term preterist really it's a grammatical term. It refers to a kind of like the past tense is what it means, the past tense. Preterists understand either that today most preterists understand that a good bit of Revelation was predicting what has happened in the church, but there's some things yet to be fulfilled. And so it's not that the whole thing is predicting the future. A lot of it is past, but there's still some things yet to happen. That's a preterist view. I'll say that probably, I suppose everybody who interpreted Revelation, even who held this other view that it's all happening in the church, still thought there are some things to happen, because the final judgment has not happened yet, and the final judgment is when God really gets rid of all the evil people on earth. That obviously hasn't happened. So there's still some things to happen. But so some people think that it's more sensible to think not that the whole thing's predicting our future, but that it's predicting what's happening now in the church, or what has been happening throughout history, and there's some things yet to be fulfilled.
Okay, thank you. Oh, and David's just popped a question, and not so secret hanger on has asked, what did Jesus think that the end looked like?
Oh, yeah, no, it's a good question. It's actually kind of how I end my book, because Jesus was also an apocalyptic thinker. He also thought that God was soon going to wipe out everything opposed to him and bring in a good kingdom on earth. But there are two ways that Jesus was really different from John of Patmos, because they have that basic idea in common, but the way they work it out is very, very different in significant ways. One way that it's different is that Jesus did not think that when God wiped out everybody who was opposed to him, there would be one disaster after the other, suffering after suffering after suffering, misery after misery after misery, and torture. In the book of Revelation, there are passages of torture where God sends horrible suffering. I mean, one of the key passages is God releases these huge number of locusts out of the bottomless pit that have a sting like scorpions in their tails. They're like flying locusts, and they sting a scorpion, and they are to sting everybody in the earth who's not one of Christ's close followers. They sting everybody who has the mark of the beast on them. And these people then who get stung suffer horribly in excruciating pain for 5 months, and they're not allowed to die to escape the pain. This is God doing this to everybody on earth except for the slaves, the followers of Jesus. And like Jesus had nothing like that. Jesus' view was not that God's going to torture everybody, but that he'll destroy everybody. He's going to annihilate everybody. So that's one big difference that strikes me as rather significant. The other big difference is that Jesus taught that the people who will escape this coming onslaught were the people who lived lives that God wanted, which meant that they helped people who were in need. They feed the hungry, they house the homeless, they visit the lonely, they take care of people who are in need. Those are the ones who will come into the kingdom, whether they know about who Jesus is or not. For example, in the parable of the sheep and the goats in Matthew chapter 25, people who never even heard of Jesus are brought into the kingdom because they helped those in need. And those who didn't give a damn about anybody else, but just themselves, are sent off to be destroyed in the furnace of fire, where they'll be annihilated. John of Revelation does not have that idea. John has no interest in whether people are good to other people or whether they help those in need. John's view is you've got to believe in Jesus and you've got to have a very precise understanding of what the Christian faith is that's just like John's. Otherwise, you're going to be thrown into the lake of burning sulfur. Jesus has a message that I really admire, to the extent that I think he really did think that we needed to live our lives in order to help people, not just to be self-centered, and that doing that means you're on God's side. So I appreciate that message. I don't appreciate John's message that you're going to be tormented if you don't agree with John. And I end my book by asking whether John is really a follower of Jesus. He does think that he's a Christian. He's an ardent Christian. But would Jesus have recognized him as one of his followers? I don't think so. I think John has a completely different set of interests from Jesus.
Matthew, if you don't mind, thank you. That was excellent.
Yeah,
If you don't mind, I am going to invite David off mute. Bart, David runs a podcast called Skeptics and Seekers. It is quite a good show. And David has been sitting just hoping that I would get activated to go rescue some poor person in a boat. And I'll tell you that people know their boats as well as they know their Bible. So it can be rough out there. But David has been hoping that I would get activated to go and pull some boat off of some piece of land somewhere. But I would like to invite him, if you don't mind, to spend a few minutes and ask whatever's on his mind, because
absolutely,
David's a good interviewer. And so, David, if you'd like, the mic's open.
Cool. Thanks. I think that you've mischaracterized me, though, Andrew. I was actively sending false alerts, but I couldn't figure out exactly how to send them, and anyway, I'm going to need your help telling me how to hack the system. Bart, so I recognize that Jesus, you feel like he was more of an annihilationist as opposed to a torturer. But a couple of other things just as follow-up. Follow-up number one, what was the reward? I mean, if there was going to be an end game in Jesus' apocalypse, what are we playing for? Because you mentioned in the book, it's not wealth and the typical view of heaven. So what was the prize for people who were faithful? And then the second question is, Jesus seems in the Olivet Discourse to say that it's all, not just the destruction of the temple, but all of it is coming soon within this generation. And it strikes me that if that is what he was saying, and if that's what he believed, then he's a false prophet, and we shouldn't dance around the fact that Jesus is just flat out a false prophet. So for the sake of the Christian audience, how do you save Jesus from being a false prophet if he was that wrong about the end game?
Okay. Yeah. Great questions. Great question. Thank you. In terms of the end game, my sense is that, for one thing, I think Jesus is an anti-materialist. When he tells people to sell everything and give to the poor, and when he praises people for doing that, so that they'll have treasures in heaven. I don't think that this is an investment strategy where you give up something now so you have a lot more later. And so I don't think that he has in mind that you're going to be fabulously wealthy in the material sense. I think Jesus was anti-materialist to the core. And I think that what Jesus was looking forward to was a paradise kind of existence that would be a return to the Garden of Eden. When God created humans, he gave them this garden, and they didn't have fine houses and fine clothing and lots of money. They had a perfect place where they were. It was a lovely place with all the food they could want and just simple pleasures. And then humans mucked it up, lost paradise. I think Jesus thought paradise was coming back to the earth, that the kingdom of God would be a place where God would rule people, and that this would be it'd be a perfect place where there'd be no more sin and pain and misery or suffering. He doesn't spell it out, but I suspect that his idea was that we return to Eden. So, was Jesus a false prophet? I think that's stronger language than I would use. My view is that everybody is right about some things and wrong about other things. And I think Jesus was fully human. Even when I was a Christian, I thought Jesus was fully human and that humans make mistakes. The mistake in this case is thinking that it's going to happen soon. It didn't happen soon. So he was wrong. He was wrong about that. I don't think that means that Christians can't believe in Jesus. I think it means if they believe in Jesus, they should believe in the traditional doctrine of the incarnation, where Jesus really did become a human. Part of the problem is most evangelicals and fundamentalists that I know, probably most Christians that I know, don't really think Jesus is human. They'll say that he's human and divine, but they really mean he's divine. He's got to be all-knowing, all powerful. When he was an infant, he could have spoken Swahili. I mean, he could do anything, and he knew everything. And I think that the incarnation indicates that he really became 100% human. He became 100% human, then he could make human mistakes. And people say, well, yeah, but then he wasn't God. I say, well, okay, if he wasn't God, but if he's fully God, he wasn't human. So which way are you going to have it? And so anyway, I would agree that he was wrong about when the end was coming. When I was a Christian and I knew he was wrong as a liberal Christian, I said he got the calendar wrong, but he had the idea right, that in the end, good will prevail and God will triumph and death is not the last word. I don't believe that anymore. I don't think good will necessarily prevail, and I think death is the last word. But if I were a Christian, that's definitely what I would think. Not that, I wouldn't call him a false prophet. I would just say got that one wrong.
You're nicer than me, Bart. I would, by the same standard that Christians, right? But see, by the same standards that Christians call other people false prophets, if you apply that to Jesus being wrong, he's a false prophet. By the standard that the Old Testament used, he would be a false prophet. So I would just put that label on him, and so the only debate for me would be, well, was he wrong or not? But that said, if I can do one small follow-up, and it actually doesn't have anything.
Can I just say that you're right? If that's your standard, then everybody's a false prophet, and Jesus is too. But it would be appropriate if you say everybody else who got something wrong was a false prophet, then Jesus is too. Yeah, if that's your standard. It's not my standard. I mean, it's not my standard.
I appreciate that. So my only other question is more of a personal type question. My favorite book of yours was God's Problem. I read it several years ago. In it, you introduced me to the book of Ecclesiastes, and I want to say thank you for that, because I really enjoy to this day Ecclesiastes because of your book there. But that book was largely focused on the problem of evil, and for you at the time, I know this was some years ago, that was the biggest problem for you. That was the walkout problem for you. And so after having some time to reflect and study and, think other thoughts, is the problem of evil for you still the biggest God problem that Christians face, or is it something else?
My view is it's the only God problem. I continue to think that. People a lot of people where I live in the South think that, if you can't trust the Bible, then God can't exist. I just think that's the craziest thing I ever heard. What? What's the Bible got to do with whether God exists or not? God exists, whatever the Bible is, or he doesn't exist, whatever the Bible is. So for me, being an atheist means that I don't believe that there's any kind of superior divine being in the universe that is actively involved in our world, who's a good and loving, powerful God. I don't believe something like that. Is there some other kind of divine being? And how the hell would I know? I've got no idea. No, neither does anyone else. But when I say that I don't believe in God, I mean I don't believe in the traditional Jewish and Christian God as a God. There's this being who created the world, or even if he didn't create the world, he's like active in the world, and he answers prayer. And when people are suffering, he listens to them and he helps them out and he saves people. I don't believe there's a God like that in the world. Period. Is there some kind of God in the world? I don't know. So I don't see any other reason not to believe in God. I mean, problems with the Bible would have no bearing on my belief in God, because so what? God didn't inspire a Bible. It doesn't mean God doesn't exist. He just didn't inspire a Bible. Didn't do a lot of things. Didn't inspire a Quran either. So,
Right.
yeah. Does that answer your question, David?
It does, and I just want to say thank you for answering those questions. Thank you, Andrew and Matt, for giving me these few moments. I will go ahead and mute my mic again. I very much appreciate it.
Thank you for that, David. Andrew, have you got anything before we wind up?
Bart, I've read a lot of your books. I don't know if I've read them all. I'm not sure that I could remember what they all were, but I read everything I see that you write. And I do because you're one of the very best demonstrations of why scholarship really matters. So thank you for what you write. Thank you for your blog. Thank you for dressing up Still Unbelievable. It was a pleasure to have you here. And do you have, I mean, we're talking about Armageddon because that's your newest book, but I'm betting that you've got one, on your desk that you're working on now. And would you like to preview one along with Armageddon that is out and people should buy right now?
Well, the one I'm writing now is I'm always writing a book. I've got a book contract for the next one, and it's how do I explain it? I think I'm in my head. I'm calling it something like the radical teachings of Jesus, and in my head I'm thinking of a subtitle, and why no one follows them. But it's going to be a discussion of Jesus' ethical teachings about how people should live their lives. And it's going to be putting them in relationship to moral discourse, ethical discourse, like in the Greek and Roman worlds that he was in. And I'm going to be arguing that some of the features that Christianity inherited from Jesus were revolutionary in the Roman world and completely changed how we today think about ethical discourse, including things like, many of these things he's picked up from Judaism, but because Christianity took over the world and Judaism did not, these became standard views within the world, even apart from people who are Christian, but including things like helping those who are in need, even if you don't know who they are. Man, you don't find that in Greek and Roman ethical discourse. You help your friends and your family, but forget helping the poor guy on the street who's starving. Oh my God, why would you do that? But Jesus taught that. And related to that, the invention of charities, where you give money to help those who are in need. You don't have charities in the Greek and Roman worlds. People who are rich gave their money away, but it was never to help the needy. And related to all that is the doctrine of forgiveness, that if somebody really does something badly to you and expresses sorrow and says they're going to try and change their ways, that you literally forgive them and don't make them pay a price for it. Don't find that in Greek and Roman discourse either. So I'm going to be talking about these radical teachings, but I'm also going to talk about what it really means to love your neighbor as yourself. And I got to tell you, I've got a really nice house here that I live in, and I could sell it and give the money to the poor, and I don't. So I don't follow it. I don't follow Jesus' teachings, but I don't know anybody who does. But the reason is because Jesus thought the end's coming very soon. and,
Right.
and, if the end's coming soon, yeah, I saw my house. Why does it matter?
Right. Right. So everyone that is listening, there will be more people listening to this episode because you're here, frankly. So there'll be a lot of people tuning in for the first time just because you're here. Spend your pizza money on Armageddon. I picked it up at Audible, and I also have a digital copy. And it is worth spending your Friday night pizza money to buy this book. And here on Still Unbelievable, we don't ask for money through Patreon or to send us money through any other vehicle. So buy this book. Do us a favor. Buy this book and save up some pizza money for the next one. Bart, I'll be saving money for the next one.
Okay.
Matthew?
Thank you very much. Final question for me then is, which Bart Ehrman book should I read next?
The book that my best-selling book is Misquoting Jesus, by far my best-selling book. But it really depends what you're interested in. I've written books on, why I'm not a believer, which is the book that David mentioned, called God's Problem. I've written a book called How Jesus Became God, which why is it Christians started thinking that he was a divine being after thinking he was a human being. One of my recent books is called Heaven and Hell, where I argue that Christian ideas that you die and your soul goes to heaven or hell is not found in the Bible and is not the teaching of Jesus. And so I explain where it came from. So
that was a great one. That's a good book. Yeah, that's a good book.
Yeah. The thing is, books are like your babies. Like, you love every one of them.
Okay.
You're not supposed to have favorites.
Okay. I guess I'm visiting a bookshop shortly. Okay. Yeah. And then just to lighten the mood then, before we head off to our usual final question, you do make reference in your book about the Tim LaHaye series Left Behind. How can you not talk about this without at some point making reference to that? But the reason why I bring it up was I was still very much a Christian when I started reading that. I was at a Christian conference. I saw the first 3 books there in a book just on a stall there, and I took a punt and I bought all 3 and absolutely loved them and started continuing to consume them. Then I started deconstructing, and by the time I was 3/4 of the way through their series of books, I was no longer enjoying them. I no longer believed. I found them absolutely tedious. But I finished this series because I felt I should, not because I wanted to. And I regret it because I just didn't enjoy it after that point. It was awful and it was tedious and it was hard work.
Yeah. Well, I know the thing is, you only got so much time in your life to read books, and you probably ought to read good ones.
Yes. I should have learnt my lesson then and stopped when I stopped enjoying them. But there we go.
His earlier books were, he wrote a book with his wife Beverly before he was into the end times thing. That was a book about how Christians can have sex.
Wow.
So it's like what's legitimate for Christians having sex.
Wow.
It's always within marriage, but they kind of go into some detail.
Really?
It also was a big seller.
Was it? Oh, okay. Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah, don't go there.
Yeah, thank you so much for the past 2 hours, but I've had a really nice time. And I will drop an email back to your agent to say thank you. And I would love if you're able to have a conversation about Jesus mythicism, because I know that thing exists. So I'd like to understand a little bit more about that. So if you don't mind, I'll go back to your agent and I'll ask if we can arrange to have that conversation, if that's the kind of thing that you would like to have, because I would love to arrange that. And I know Andrew would.
Oh yes, that's another of my books that you may want to put on your list.
Okay.
Did Jesus exist?
Okay, maybe I'll go get that one and we'll come back and we'll see if we can have that conversation, because that's something I would love to do. Okay, cool. So in that case, to wrap up then, do you have a favorite Bible character and who are they? Yeah,
so you had mentioned that this might come up, and I'm racking my brains because I actually love the Bible. I'm an atheist who loves the Bible, but there aren't a lot of characters that I really much admire as characters. But I'll say, one character that I really think about a lot is in Mark chapter 14, verse 51. the guy who's when Jesus is getting arrested, who's wearing a linen cloth over his body, and they grab him and he runs away naked. he's the only streaker in the New Testament.
Wow, I'm gonna have to
that's
go back and read that.
That's a good figure.
Is this person named?
No, it's the big mystery. Today, most people say, "Oh, that must be Mark, the author," because who else would know about that? Which is another verisimilitude thing.
I can hear the song in my head right now. They call him the Streak.
Yeah, right. That's it.
So chic. Awesome. Brilliant. Go pick up your Bible, listeners, and read that verse with new vigor.
Yeah.
Thank you once again. It's been wonderful having you on. Thank you for staying with us, listeners, and until next time, be reasonable. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Okay, my pleasure.
Really
thanks.
appreciate your time.
That's great. Great fun.
You have been listening to a podcast from Reason Press. Do you have any thoughts on what you've just heard? Do you have a topic that you would like us to cover? Please send all feedback to reasonpress@gmail.com. You might even appear on an episode. Our theme music was written for us by Holly. To hear more of her music, see the links in our show notes.